Welcome to Answering Jesse Johnson, in which I seek to provide an answer to Jesse's anti-Christian nationalist message at this year's Shepherd's Conference. Now, I've called this message Answering Jesse Johnson because of what Proverbs 18 states. Proverbs 18:17 says, "The first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him." And I know that there's a lot of brothers that would have found Jesse's message to be compelling. And yet, I believe that if you have an opportunity to hear some answers to what Jesse presented, you would find that the case that Jesse presents is far less compelling than at first glance. Now, to be fair, Jesse and I do come at this topic from very, very different positions. Jesse's argued that mosques popping up in your neighborhood is actually a good thing. And I would argue the exact opposite. I don't believe that God has given to civil magistrates the authority and the sword for the purpose of protecting what is essentially organized public idolatry and blasphemy, especially when that organized religion seeks to overthrow your nation and force all of the inhabitants at sword point in forced conversions. So Jesse and I approach this topic from very different positions. Nevertheless, I'm going to play the video and I'll pause it and provide some commentary as we go. Now, Jesse divides his message into two parts. And so I'll probably do this video in two parts, and we'll see what happens from there. So join with me here.
Well, in the early 5th century, Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, found himself on the precipice of unparalleled societal collapse. The Roman Empire was on the verge of falling, and the Visigoths were basically knocking at his door, and his congregation was asking him questions about how to understand the fall of Rome. And here was the dynamic that Augustine was trying to navigate.
Now, I will just say I've sped Jesse's message up to 1.5 speed, and so it will be a little faster than it was originally presented. And the first few minutes are a little bit slow, so bear with me. But I can assure you, it does get a lot more exciting as the video goes.
As you look back through the previous centuries of the Roman Empire, when Rome was at its strongest, is when they were persecuting Christians. When Christianity was on the rise, Rome fell. So how do you navigate that as a pastor when people are asking you, what is the Lord doing? Why is God bringing this empire to a screeching halt? People were quick to blame the Christians. If only the Christians would have also served the Roman gods, then God would have seen fit to extend the length of the Roman Empire. But instead, the Romans were being converted to Christ, and the empire fell. Augustine spent 10 years plus writing an answer to that question, which is the form of his book, The City of God. And the book is so complex. If you've read City of God, it defies summary, really. It's part philosophy, part theology, part history. The first 8 or 9 books or so, he spends largely making fun of the Roman deities, which did not win him friends or influence people. From there, he moved on to addressing the reality that there is a city on earth. It's a city of man. People have hopes in the city of man. They have loves, compassions, desires. They have all the ethos and pathos of city of man is alive in people's hearts. And there's a city of God in the world as well. And you have people that interact with both of those cities, but they couldn't be more different. On the outside, the two cities can even look the same, but their ends are categorically different. And I think we would all agree with that, and I think the American church, by and large, would agree with that as well. But what would get Augustine in trouble today, if he were to say it, is his main conclusion of the book as I read it, which is that the fate of the city of man is disconnected from the activity in the city of God. That as the kingdom of God advances and waxes and wanes, it does not affect the duration of the city of man. I mean, as I read Augustine, I take that away to be his main point. This militates against the idea that is so prevalent in American Christianity that if only the church would stand up and do this, we could win back our culture. If only the church would do this or that or the other thing, you're sick of inflation, you're sick of open borders, you're sick of rainbow flags on your elementary school teachers' lapels. Well, if only the church would stand up and be the church, we could bring a stop to that. And there's this contradiction in so much of American Christianity that the United States is a nation under judgment by God for our conduct, and at the same time, the church has the power to stop that judgment or to avoid that judgment or to direct society in a different direction. And you can see that those two are in conflict with each other. Either we're under the judgment of God or we're not.
All right, well, that's a great spot to stop and pause for just a moment. I think this is a good illustration of a lot of what's presented in this video, and that is here a false dichotomy. It's just a logical fallacy, and it's biblically inaccurate. So Romans 1 would portray what it looks like when a society abandons God and he gives them over in his wrath. And I think many Christians today would say that, yes, we are a nation under the wrath of God. However, Jeremiah 18, God does tell us how he deals with nations. Um, Jeremiah chapter 18, God speaks and he says, at one moment, I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to uproot, to tear down, or to make perish. But if that nation against which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the calamity I planned to do against it. And so they're both true. Just because this nation is under the judgment of God doesn't mean we are too far gone. And we see this illustrated not only with Israel at multiple times, but with the preaching of Jonah. You know, they were just a month out before destruction was about to come. So, in one sense, this is a false dichotomy, but in another sense, it really doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter because whether or not we're under the judgment of God, that doesn't change the revealed will for civil magistrates. God has a revealed will for rulers. What does he require of them with their delegated authority? What does it look like for Christ to exercise his authority in every sphere? That doesn't change whether or not a nation is under judgment. And so, yes, we continue to preach the gospel, whether a nation is under judgment or not. But remembering that preaching the gospel doesn't ever exhaust our Christian duties, particularly when you live in a constitutional republic like we do. So we always preach the gospel. That's always true. But whether or not we're a nation under the judgment of God is ultimately irrelevant. And to pit that against God being able to bless this nation is just simply unbiblical. So let's jump back in here and we'll let Jesse keep going.
How do you engage with people that are under God's judgment? Of course, you preach the gospel to them and appeal for repentance. Augustine comes along and says the spiritual condition of a society is disconnected from the rise and fall of the city of man. Nations come and nations go, and the word of the Lord lives forever. And you cannot, as a Christian, try to manipulate that or direct that. You cannot control the way God causes nations to rise and fall. If Augustine couldn't control the rise and fall of Rome, what do you think you're going to do? And that's the reality.
And maybe again, we just pause here and note that we're not trying to contradict Augustine, but I think we also need to acknowledge that um, the health, we might say it that way, the size of the local church absolutely is impacted by the nation in which it's found. Go look at North Korea. Um, how we might say healthy, how large is the church in North Korea? How large is the church in Afghanistan? Right. So the idea that what's happening civilly in a nation has no impact on Christianity within that nation is just simply unbiblical. But not only that, this language of manipulating, nobody's trying to manipulate anything here, not, at least not that I know of. My understanding is that God has instructed us on what he wants done, and we are called to do it. That's not manipulation. That's called obedience and faithfulness. So I think it's not helpful to use this manipulation language, but let's continue on.
Behind Augustine's City of God. It's in that context today that I want to talk to you about Christian nationalism. The title is How You Shepherd Christian Nationalism, or Shepherd People Through Christian Nationalism in an Election Year, which is like 3 subtitles in that, but that's fine. I thought of that while I was reading Augustine. He's the king of 87 subtitles. You know, does your church hand out voter guides? Do you have the American flag on the pulpit? Do you organize little buses to take the elderly to go vote and cure their ballots? Do you get involved in elections? Do you have people running for office come and speak to your church? Do you tell your church to mobilize and get active in order to win over society? Do you go after an election as a motivation in your church? And Christian nationalism is rising right now. I think there was by and large a consensus that 10 years ago it was waning, that it was on the decline, but then COVID comes and churches get closed and the borders get opened and inflation goes up, and you have the kind of the so-called evangelical elites that sat back and seemed to cheer all of that on, didn't they? And they seemed to rejoice in the open borders, and they seemed to rejoice in the churches being closed. And when you have groups like the ERLC and other groups like that that are really celebrating restrictions on church, you have a lot of people in your own churches, I'm sure, that are looking at that and going, our Christian leaders, our religious leaders are selling us out. There has to be a better way to navigate this. And so they're drawn to people that are talking with conviction and clarity in the political world. At least that has been my experience. The people that I have met in the last few years have been drawn towards Christian nationalism. That's what's drawn them that way, is they think, it used to be even 5 years ago. It was just in Christianese. When you were asked a layperson in your church to pray before a meal at a church potluck or before an evening service or whatever, and they weren't prepared, they would get up behind the pulpit or behind the casserole, and they would start their prayer by saying, God, we're thankful that we live in a country that is free and lets us meet here without restrictions, and we don't take that for granted, and thank God for the casserole. And you don't hear those prayers anymore, do you? And the people that used to pray them are looking around going, well, what happened? And they're being drawn towards Christian nationalism. So, of course, any discussion on Christian nationalism has to begin with definitions. How do you define Christian nationalism? Well, I'll start there. If you ask NPR, which I don't recommend, a Christian nationalist is anyone who is to the right of Justice Sotomayor. A Christian nationalist is anyone who is pro-life, has a Bible, a Jesus fish on their car, or has voted Republican in the last 20 years. Would make you a Christian nationalist. Not a very helpful definition. If you ask somebody like Al Mohler, he describes himself as a Christian nationalist. The definition he operates from is kind of just the two words exist independently of each other. In Mohler's lexicon, nationalism is the belief that there are nations, and that nations should, generally speaking, look out for their own interests above other nations. That's just a larger political theory. Christian is attaching the word Christian to that. There's nations that look out for their own interests, and some of those nations are Christian, and Mohler would clarify that that's by their Judeo-Christian heritage. The Anglo-Protestant legal tradition is the phrase Mohler often uses, that Western civilization has come out of this Anglo-Protestant tradition from the Reformation forward that has given us common law, the notion of common law, and the sense of liberty and democracy and all of that. And that's what he means by Christian nationalism. And I think Mohler's description of Christian nationalism makes so much more sense if you just take it out and substitute the word conservatism. When he talks about it, he really means conservative, and not in like slowing down the cultural decline, but in recognizing that there's a legal tradition that stretches back hundreds of years that is the basis of liberty and democracy, and we should embrace that legal tradition. And that's fine.
Let me pause there. I do want to play a clip from Dr. Mohler from just a few months ago that explains his position maybe a little more fully. It's not fleshed out all the way, but it's a little more advanced than what Jesse produces here. But also, I would want to answer and just note that when we talk about conservatism, nationalism is only one part of conservatism. And I think if we're being honest, I think most Christians are totally unprepared for a discussion of nationalism. So if we take nationalism and we affix the adjective Christian, what is a nation historically? How have nations been defined, understood? What are they biblically? Can we do a biblical theology of nationhood? And so we're entering into some territory that most believers are really unprepared to interact. And so much of this discussion is all in how you frame it. And that's what we're going to see Jesse do here is frame the matters. But we'll get to that. Before we do, I do want to just play this clip from Mohler. And I think what's fascinating is Mohler's being asked about the role of the Ten Commandments, and particularly the first table in contrast to the second table. And he makes, as a Baptist, Mohler is unashamedly a Baptist. He makes some very pointed comments about the constitutional importance of acknowledging the first table. This is going well beyond conservatism. So let's listen to Mohler for a minute. I think this is about 2 minutes long, if I remember right, and it begins with Mohler being asked a question.
One of the things I'm curious for either one of you is talking about the Enlightenment project and the way they wanted to keep a Christian morality, but to deny it from kind of a Christian theology. And that seems to be similar to the way in which some have said that we can try to impose or to make use of the second table of the law, but not the first table of the law. And I'm just wondering how you understand those two things. So Steve, you had already mentioned that a little bit. Is there a place today, and so maybe this is a historical question, or maybe it's one of just political theory in some of these newer questions. Should the first and the second table of the law be a source of enforcement today, or are we only going with the second? And if only the second, does history show us that the denial of the first table and the worship of God actually makes it impossible to maintain the second? Dr. Mohler, what do you think?
I think that we need a language structure to try to figure out how we're going to talk about this. So the way I put it is this: I don't believe that Western civilization can endure without acknowledging the first table of the law and obeying the second table. And so I'm a Baptist, I'm a conversionist. So I can't say that the civilization is to be predicated upon confessional faith as is reflected in the first table of the law. I can say that our society won't survive without the historical acknowledgement of it. And that's a position the left, I would say, is just oppressive privilege. But that happens to be not only true, I say, as a Christian, it's also true, I say, as an historian, in terms of American history. So I want to be careful. I think where the integralists and some forms of Christian nationalists, theonomists, make a huge mistake is that I want to require citizens to acknowledge the first table of the law. But, in order to call them believers, I'm going to have to abandon my theology, which I can't do because of my.
So Mohler here appears, for all intents and purposes, to be saying that citizens need to acknowledge the first table. Let's keep going.
Because of my understanding of the gospel. And so I'm a conversionist. And so and I'm also, a Baptist. So I can't baptize babies and now say they are now, effectively participants in the church in the sense of the first table of the law. So I hope that makes sense. Those are terms I've tried consistently to use. I think our society, historically and in the present and in the future, should and must acknowledge the first table of the law. And that should be a matter of constitutional importance, but it must obey.
That to me is fascinating. I'd love to hear Mohler expand upon that. But the idea that acknowledging the first table is a matter of constitutional importance. I don't know if that sounds like the Baptist theology that you're used to hearing. It's definitely not the Baptist theology that Jesse presents, but I think as we do a little more study, it's not that far from historic Baptist theology as is often presented. Well, let's jump back into Jesse, since we've talked about nationalism, conservatism, Baptist, Mohler's position, and we'll let Jesse continue on.
And well, that's fully compatible with every statement of faith that's probably represented in this room. There's nothing overly controversial with that form of Christian nationalism. And so that's not my desire to critique that form of Christian nationalism at all, for lots of reasons. But the form of Christian nationalism that is more prevalent in our churches, in my experience, that is more dangerous in our churches, and is probably why you're here today, is much more of the active form of nationalism, the call for some kind of Christian prince or Christian leader to engage in leadership in our nation, to galvanize the church, and to see some kind of melding of the church-state relationship. I'm thinking of, I brought this up for show and tell today, The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. It's a long book. It's very well written and well researched, and it's had an outsized impact on a lot of our churches as people have read it, and they're reading it, and they're being drawn to the answers that he's offering, and that there's hope in the church by placing this desire to see a reformation inside of government and see our nation linked with a kind of Christian nationalism. Wolfe, in this book, defines Christian nationalism as, quote, the totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. So it's a detailed definition. It's a little bit circular. His version of Christian nationalism is basically things the Christian nation does. So it becomes a little bit circular. But when you go through his understanding of Christian nationalism and what is appealing to people about it, it's very much an active role from the government in propagating the Christian faith. It's this idea that the government has an active command of God, or an active duty from God to propagate the Christian faith, to guard the church from heretics, to rebuke slothful or lazy ministers, to summon church synods and councils, to clarify statements of faith, to fund missions, to have oversight in general sense of the church of God on earth. Say it in a way that I think would honor Wolfe's larger argument. In most of the Christian nationalism books that I have read, they would argue that the government has a role in fostering true religion, in keeping the church accountable, and guarding them from heretics. The core of that form of Christian nationalism is the idea that a nation properly expressed exists.
Okay, so let's pause there. This is very helpful. He does give Wolfe's definition, and if you haven't noticed, it is Wolfe's book in particular that he is going to be addressing. Now, what's fascinating is he's focusing on Wolfe's book, and that's good. It's a book that has gotten a fair amount of publicity. But I think it's also interesting, and Jesse rightly avoids this error. So many have argued that Christian nationalism is tied to postmillennialism, and Wolfe is a Presbyterian amillennialist. He's an explicit amill. He is not postmill at all. And so what you have then essentially is one of the loudest voices for Christian nationalism is amill. But as Wolfe talks about, a totality of social customs and civil laws, and this Christian prince who leads in that action. Listen, I'm not interested in defending Wolfe's position on, the civil magistrate calling councils. I don't agree with that. But I think one of the issues here is that we don't think about what nations do deeply enough. And so The executive of a nation does a lot of these things. And our nation does have federal holidays. You think about it, we celebrate 4th of July, and that creates a culture in our nation. We celebrate Christmas, that is a federal holiday. Thanksgiving is a federal holiday. And those are explicitly Christian holidays. So our nation does have explicitly Christian holidays. And maybe if I push it even a little bit further, my fear is that many are very unawares of our nation's historical tradition. So even if I just back things up a bit and I pull up, for example, George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation. This was given in 1789. This is what kings and presidents do. This is what they do. They've always done this. Listen to what our president, the first president of the United States, said in this Thanksgiving proclamation. I'll just read a little bit. He says, "Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God and to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. And whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested me to, quote, recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness," end quote. "Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th of November, to be devoted by the people of the United States to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all good that was, that is, that will be, that we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks." And he continues on. But this nation understood that you could have a civil leader, the president, who led the people in a call for national prayer and thanksgiving. Now, this is just the history of our nation. And the fact that this was a Christian nation has really been well documented, and maybe we can come back to that topic a little bit later. But and just note, we still have what George Washington did in 1789. We still have that with our presidents today. We still have a prince, so to speak, as Stephen Wolfe would talk about with the Christian prince. This Christian prince can override the common vote of the people and do what he thinks is best. We still have that. You think about our current sitting president, Biden. He got into office and immediately signed an unprecedented number, a historical number of executive orders. Now, these are just decrees given out, not because Congress has passed any resolutions, not because the nation has voted. He's just decreeing as he goes. And not only that, he's still engaged in civil religion. So you think back just a couple weeks ago on Good Friday, he announced just a couple weeks ago that on Easter Resurrection Sunday would be the Transgender Day of Visibility. He announced that on Good Friday as a national observance. So we have a prince that does this. The question is, what type of prince should we have? And I think more importantly, the real question is, what has God revealed? What has God revealed he wants the civil magistrate to do? To do what we're currently doing or something different? And I think one of the things we need to pay close attention to is that we already have a prince doing what Wolfe is talking about in many ways, maybe not to the extent, but let's not pretend we don't already have this.
One ethnicity, and ethnicity there is almost a synonym for nation. Wolfe would say, there's some differences between them, but as I read him, he defines a nation properly constituted as existing of only one ethnicity, and that ethnicity is a shared culture, language, values, traditions, calendars, foods and social customs and all of that. And then Christian nationalism is a nation that is deliberately and intentionally Christian in those holidays, Christian in those rituals, where a government guards the Sabbath and facilitates.
Okay, let me again pause there for a moment, because we're entering into a discussion of what is a nation. And Wolfe has given a definition. It's tied to a culture. He almost makes culture and ethnicity synonymous. Ethnicity is not tied to skin color, but your language, your religion, your social customs. And here's the thing. If you were to look at our own nation's background, uh, well, let me just read a little bit here. So, for example, the Federalist Papers number two. Federalist Papers number two. Listen to what is written there. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, and attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. That's just the background of our country. That is the historic understanding of a nation. Again, George Washington, in his farewell address, which was looking for the date here, 1796. He says, "The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles." So what Wolf is presenting here is really just a historical understanding of what a nation is. Now, if Jesse disagrees with that, that's fine. If he wants to argue for a very modern definition of what constitutes a nation and a historical definition of what constitutes a nation, then that's fine. Jesse can definitely do that. But I think everybody ought to understand that that's what he's doing. The current understanding of what constitutes a nation is not our own nation's historical self-understanding, nor is it the historical political theology of Protestantism, going back all the way to Luther, nor is it really a biblical theology of nations when we look at a biblical theology. So, and with all that said, maybe it's just worth pointing out something about Wolf's book. And again, I'm not a Presbyterian. I'm not a millennial. I've said that I'm a rabid dispensationalist. I feel very strongly about that. I'm pre-mill all the way. But the thing with Wolf's book, I've seen a lot of critique that it's not biblical enough. There's not a lot of scripture in it. And I think it's worth just making this quick comment about Wolf's book. Wolf's book, if we were to think about learning a foreign language, when Jesse and I went to Hebrew, we learned Greek, and when we went to seminary, we learned Greek and Hebrew. And you start out with grammar. What is the alphabet? What are the consonants? What are the vowels? And you start memorizing all those things. And eventually you get to where you're interpreting words and diagramming sentences. And when you finally get to exegesis, you move from grammar in your first year to exegesis in your second year. In exegesis, you're not talking about how letters are pronounced and what their name are. You're past that. And I think what many people have wrongly assumed about Wolf's book, even though he explicitly says otherwise, Wolf's book was not intended to be a Greek grammar. It is a Greek exegesis. He assumes you're coming to the book with an understanding of historical Protestant political theory. If you don't know those things, it's not his fault that he's not teaching you the alphabet. I mean, let's be fair. It's an advanced exegesis textbook. It is not an introductory grammar textbook. And it's not his fault that you come to the book wanting an introductory grammar. So that's why he doesn't engage heavily with the exegesis of the scriptures. He's arguing from historical Protestant theology. And, if you know it, great. Then this book will be profitable for you. If you don't know it, then it can be frustrating. All right, back to Jesse.
Church worship on the Sabbath is an example he often uses. And again, it rebukes slothful ministers and has oversight in a general sense of the church. In this form of Christian nationalism, the political leader, in a sense, is the protector of the church. The political leader in this kind of Christian nationalism is not a pastor. He's not doing the sacraments or the ordinances. He's not preaching. He's not baptizing babies in this form of Christian nationalism. He's not doing those things, but he's keeping watch over it.
Now, again, if you just read through the historic confessions, that is the normal Protestant position. If you disagree with it, that's fine, but let's not pretend that he's arguing for something foreign to Protestantism.
That has an appeal to our current generation of evangelicals, especially younger people who are drawn towards kind of an authoritative protector of the church when they see, as I mentioned earlier, a previous generation of people who were to be protecting the church have kind of abdicated their responsibilities. I won't drag you through all this book, but I did, just to let you know where I'm going, I have 4 critiques of this form of Christian nationalism, not just this book, but that form of Christian nationalism, that are philosophical, and then I have 5 critiques that are theological. So that's where I'm headed. I want to critique this view of Christian nationalism from a philosophical perspective, or kind of just like reading the book and saying, here's 4 things that I really don't like, and then I'll give you 5 theological reasons that you should not be a Christian nationalist.
Okay, so that is Jesse's 2-part division to his message. The first part is a 4-part philosophical critique, and that is how Jesse's going to frame the issues. And something I've noted before, so much of this discussion is all about how we frame the matters. The hearer is hearing some of these things for the first time, and how it's framed really is tremendous. And so we'll pause this a few times and address some of what Jesse says. But let's jump into his 4 philosophical points.
That's where we're headed. So first of all, I will say this. There are some good things in this kind of Christian nationalism. There are some good things. Is the way he esteems our parts of our country's past, a kind of Christian heritage, the way he defends Mayberry. There's a section in this book where he defends Mayberry, like, don't you wish your kids could grow up in the kind of cul-de-sac where they can play with their neighbors, and you don't have to know where your 10-year-old is 24/7. And there's a kind of wholesomeness that's there that he feels like we've lost. And not only have we lost it, but you have people that had criticized it, that spent decades criticizing the Christian culture as creating false morality, and Pharisees and Christian culture are bad, it interferes with the gospel. And so now everybody's listened to them, and now we've lost that culture, and we've lost Mayberry, and we've lost the cul-de-sac where kids can play in, and all of that. So I do appreciate that about his book, along with other things as well. But I do want to clearly say my 4 big concerns with the book from a philosophical perspective. First of all, it idolizes the past. It idolizes.
Okay, let's just note here the loaded language. It idolizes the past. Now, idolatry is a blatant sin for Christians, and so to use that language is pretty charged. And so, really, if it idolizes the past, then it deals with the past sinfully. It has a sinful affinity or affection for the past. That's a pretty strong claim, and that language was chosen carefully. I know Jesse prepared for this message for quite a fair amount of time. So it idolizes the past, he says. So let's keep going.
The past. He calls on Christians to kind of bring a restoration to our nation's own Christian past. He describes it as, quote, a recovery of a former shared Christian ethic and ethnic tradition and heritage. And when you start describing it like that, it forces you to re-examine the past. It forces you to ask a question: was our nation founded properly as a Christian nation? Was there a period in our nation's past where we really did function like a Christian nation? Once you start using the language of recovery, it's appropriate to ask, what are you recovering, and where are you looking for it? What are you retrieving from the past? Not everything that you retrieve from the past is good. Sometimes your golden retriever brings back a dead squirrel. You didn't want that. So what exactly is being retrieved from the past? And you would ask yourself, was there a time in the U.S. history that it was functioning as a Christian kind of nation or culture? And it's very difficult to identify that time. I mean, I dare you. Start naming a decade where you're like, that's where we had a Christian culture. And here's a thought.
I dare you. Okay. Well, I'll take your dare. Here's a little booklet you could find online. Now there's different versions of this. This is the United States, a Christian Nation. It's by Justice David Brewer. He was a United States Supreme Court justice who in the 1890s, he wrote the opinion on a unanimous decision of the court, Church of the Holy Trinity v. the United States. And after giving 80 pieces of evidence, he concludes by saying these and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation. And this little booklet is a series of lectures where he explains and proves and argues that America was a Christian nation. It's really not a disputable fact. Maybe I'll give you one more resource if it's sitting here. It is. Philip Schaff. Philip Schaff is really the church historian. You'll find his name as editor and sometimes translator of many of the ancient Near Eastern fathers, pre and post-Nicene translations. And this book, there we go, Church and State in the United States. This is written in the 1880s, so similar time as Justice Brewer's book. And Philip Schaff is very clear that in the 1880s, the United States is explicitly a Christian nation. There's no disputing it. So he says, I dare you. Well, there you go. Dare accepted.
experiment for you. You would think of that and go back to that decade and ask yourself, the Christian leaders and pastors and ministers who were around back then, what did they say about the culture when they were there? Al Mohler often goes to the 1960s. That's where
Okay, what did they say about the culture? Notice that, because the culture isn't the same exactly as the national identity of a nation. A nation can have a particular national identity, a specific self-proclamation, and yet there can be subcultures and there can be unbiblical parts of the culture, no doubt. But when he shifts here, notice that he's done that. What did they say about the cultures is what Jesse now said.
That's where everything changed, he said. 1961, Democrats and Republicans basically were the same when it came to social issues, and the sexual revolution comes, the wheels come off the car, and here we are. But go back in your mind to that era of world history or American history and ask yourself, what did the leaders of that day say about American Christianity? Evolution was on the rise. This is the decline of inerrancy, the attack on the fundamentals of the faith. This is the era where Martin Lloyd-Jones lamented American culture, particularly for its materialism, its embracing of liberalism, the racism that was rampant back then. All of that is worthy of substantial critique. Or you go back further, okay, the 1800s there. Certainly that was the Christian zenith, the 1800s, before all of liberalism, before evolution became a thing, when the denominations were rocking and you got evangelists preaching in the streets. Like that's where you're at. And then you go and read Spurgeon about that time period. Christian George's introduction of the Lost Sermons of Spurgeon has some quotes of Spurgeon about the United States. Then he called the American culture of the 1800s, quote, shameful and abominable.
The American culture. Okay. No dispute, but two questions, or 2 points rather. Again, culture as opposed to the laws, the customs, the civil religion of a nation. Those are two different things. But here's the more important issue. Why go to Brits to declare whether or not the United States was a Christian nation? Why go to foreigners who don't live here, who are seeing things only from a distance? Are they really the best critiquers of whether or not America historically was a Christian nation? I just gave you a U.S. Supreme Court Justice and church historian Philip Schaff. Why not go to those guys when they were actually here in the United States?
Abhorrent and bloodthirsty. And he said that unless the United States was punished with a graphic and brutal civil war, then the kind of justice he associates with God must not really exist. Spurgeon did not mince his words when it came to the United States. And largely Spurgeon's critique was over slavery and race relations, which he didn't excuse England from either. He said, quote, if slavery would not have come to the United States had it not been carried there from Manchester and Liverpool. He understood his own nation's complicity in that. Nevertheless, he critiqued American culture for its bloodthirsty and shameful and abominable ways. I mean, you can go back all the way to the United States founding. And think about what the evangelists of that era said about our culture. Think of the kind of things that are in our founding from the Revolution forward. Even the religious test clause in the Constitution. You can't have a religious test for government service. It's in our Constitution. That's not the kind of thing that you would put in your Constitution if you were deliberately constructing a Christian nation.
Well, let's just point out, our Constitution is explicitly a Christian Constitution. It can't come out of any other worldview, number one. And it is very clear, the Constitution being maybe part 2 of the Declaration, that all men are created equal and given certain inalienable rights by their Creator. What religion does that worldview emanate from? But not only that, even as we think about the horror of slavery that existed in the United States, does the fact that slavery existed, does that make the nation not a Christian nation? And I don't know that you would want to apply that standard. You think about a church. If a church has an area that's really outside of the revealed will of God, is it no longer a Christian church? Or how about a family? Maybe a family has an area where maybe they engage in entertainment that's really outside of the revealed will of God. Are they no longer a Christian family? Let's just be consistent. How about a lot of these Christian men who owned slaves? Were they not Christians? So we can find some spots and blemishes. Does that mean that America wasn't a Christian nation? I don't think that it does. And not only that, when we talk about religious tests, things of that nature, let's keep in mind, when our Constitution was completed, many of the states did have not many, but some of them did have religious test clauses, and many of them did have official state churches. So the legacy of our country is a system that did allow for state churches, did allow for religious tests, did allow for taxing for the support of churches. Most all the states had blasphemy laws. That didn't require that people be Christian, but it prohibited the public expression of blasphemy. So none of that is incompatible with our American system. Now, granted, yes, at a federal level, there cannot be religious tests. And at a federal level, there cannot be a established church. But that doesn't prohibit George Washington as the president, in accordance with both houses of the government, coming together and say, hey, as a nation, we need to go to Almighty God in prayer and thanksgiving. And I'm going to declare a national day for that very thing. So that is our history.
And to prove that, you could ask any of the Christian nationalists you see today, in your view of Christian nationalism, should unbelievers be allowed to have high seats in the government? Of course, it's antithetical to what they're putting forward. You know, the truth is our country wasn't founded by that concept of Christian nationalism. Obviously, there's an Anglo-Protestant legal tradition in our country. There's a form of liberty. There's a form of God providing rights to us, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men were created equal kind of language. You can't say people were created equal unless you believe that there's a creator. I mean, that's just straightforward right there. That's obviously in our country's fast. But our country chose the route of e pluribus unum, not in Christus solus. You know, we chose to embrace multiple ethnicities, multiple cultures, and amalgamate them into one nation.
Okay, notice what he did there. We chose multiple ethnicities, multiple cultures. I would argue that that's historical revisionism, because the words that we've used for ethnicities and cultures, again, look at Federalist Paper number 2, look at what George Washington says. There's not the diversity that Jesse is arguing for. Yes, there is diversity in even as Washington said. He said that with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, but it is still within Protestant Christianity. And yes, there were some Catholics as well, but we're not talking about pluralism like we have today. That wasn't the idea of our nation. Matter of fact, it couldn't even have come out based upon the founding of our nation, because the founding of our nation is predicated upon there being a creator who's created all men and given them inalienable rights. So that's going to rule out secular humanism and naturalistic materialism. It's going to rule out Islam. I mean, those are fundamentally un-American. But all of that, again, just continues to sidestep the point. What is God's revealed will? That's the question. So let's jump back in here. This idolizing of the past. I don't think anybody's trying to idolize the past. I think we're trying to recover what was our country intended to function like. What did it look like originally, contrasted to what it looked like now? Is the way forward, is a way of honoring God to be found in how we used to do things? That's what's going on here, I think, with this study of our past and our history. Not an idolization of it, but a study of it to say, how were things done before?
Rather than to say that we are a nation of a distinct Christian ethnic identity. It's also not the 1619 Project. My point is, at no point in America's history did we have really a Christian culture, the kind of which that is argued for by proponents of Christian nationalism. My second concern about this form of Christian nationalism is that, first of all, it idealizes the past, but second, it impossibilizes the present. Impossibilizes is not a real word, but it's going to fit with my outline. And I'm
okay,
more
impossibilizes the present.
Impossibilizes the present.
At the end of the day, that's totally irrelevant. What has God called us to do? Whether or not it's possible, we are not pragmatists. We are called to do God's things God's way, and we leave the results to Him. We don't look at something and say, "Oh, that's impossible." It's just not. It's not how the Christian life works. So,
presents an ideal for people that draws them in that is impossible to obtain. Wolf says that Christian nationalism has never truly been experienced in our country, but that's almost, he reads as if he's saying it's because we haven't tried enough. We haven't sought to put it into place with enough effort. In other words, all that's missing is willpower. But the truth is that's not what's missing in our country. It's not a matter of the church standing up and being the church and getting more of your congregation to vote and finally take our country back. That's not it at all. The problem in our own country is that we're just dealing with a numbers game. The way is narrow that leads to life. If you're dealing in a democracy, the majority wins, and the church, the true church, is never going to be the majority. We're dealing in a culture now that is what is often called the negative world for Christianity, and that language I think is helpful. Before the 1960s, Christianity had more or less a positive connotation in our culture. From the 1960s to 2010 or so, it had a neutral connotation. In other words, if you wanted to excel in politics in the 1940s or 50s, you probably had to be a church member. From the 1960s to 2010, it didn't matter. You could be or you didn't have to be. Nobody really cared. But now it's a detriment. Now it's a negative association with you. If you want to rise in society, being associated with the church has a negative impact on you. So it's hard to make that jive with this idea of Christian nationalism, that if only the majority of people would rise up and reclaim their Christian identity, if you're functioning in a society with a negative view of Christianity. The reality is that we are the remnant.
So here would be the question. We have a Speaker of the House who has been called a Christian nationalist. You know, the guy's a very milquetoast vanilla Christian. There's not much Christian nationalist about him. There's nothing extremist about him. And yet the mainstream media calls him an extremist. And yet what he's arguing for are just basics of Christianity. So here's the question. How is it that our culture thinks basic fundamentals of Christianity are extremist? What does that say about what the church has done in engaging the culture or not engaging the culture over the past decades? If they think a guy like Mike Johnson is an extremist, what does that say about our own witness?
I mean, I even think back to what presidential election it was in the 2000s where Rick Warren moderated the debates. Do you remember that? He moderated a presidential debate. Could you imagine today? And he got lambasted for it even back then for being too Christian. And what's President Obama doing on the stage with Rick Warren of all people? The whole thing just seems comical in retrospect. It's such a different world even from now. The truth is the church is the remnant. The church is the remnant. And when you start angling for a victory at the box office, that makes you, or at the ballot box, California football right there. If you're angling for a victory at the ballot box, it forces you to make coalitions and partnerships and political alliances to drum up a majority. That's the way politics works. If you're going to lobby for a certain measure to be passed, you have to partner with the Catholic Church. You have to partner with the Mormon Church, or what's so-called. You have to partner with all of the different groups to get it across the finish line because the objective is political. In our culture today, the church cannot advance something that far. If you take the Benedict option as your political model that you're going to retreat and make your own Christian society, don't be surprised if you have to partner with Benedictine monks. That's how that strategy works. Now, for law issues, that's fine. To pass pro-life legislation for issues of law, where the government is checking evil, pro-life legislation, school vouchers, that kind of stuff. So there's law issues. It's fine to be co-belligerent with people that aren't Christians. That's fine, but not for gospel issues. Gospel issues, there's an exclusivity of it. You're not a co-belligerent in a gospel issue with people that aren't regenerates. But in Christian.
Now, I don't know of anybody that is saying that we need to be co-belligerents in gospel issues with people who aren't Christians. That's an interesting objection, but I just don't know of anybody that's doing that. The civil magistrate prohibiting blasphemy, that is not a gospel issue. Anyway.
Christian nationalism, that divide gets erased. And the way it's presented, as I read this form of Christian nationalism, it presents a union between law and gospel issues, both under the general authority of the government, which requires a kind of partnership that erodes gospel distinctives. The majority of a nation will never be able to institutionalize true religion. That's the problem. And what's missing from all these books about Christian nationalism is examples of this kind of government actually having occurred in church history. And that's because the majority is generally wrong. The true church is the minority. And at some point, you just have to ask yourself, what am I supposed to do? If I believe in Christian nationalism, I want to be a Christian nationalist, let's roll, let's go do this thing. Let's do it. What do I do now? Vote harder? Press the button harder? I'm going to run out of options here. Get my neighbor to press the button? I mean, you're in California. How many people you got to get to vote here to make a difference?
What are we supposed to do? Well, to answer that question, what we're supposed to do is recover God's revealed will for the civil magistrate. And I get Jesse thinks God's revealed will for the civil magistrate is that we have mosques popping up in our country, that blasphemy and idolatry can run rampant. And so the question is, hey, could Jesse be right? Sure, let's grant that he could be right. But most Christians and most pastors are woefully unprepared to debate these issues, to understand the different positions, who holds the positions, why they hold those positions, how those positions hold up historically. And so what are we supposed to do? I think what it is we need to recover orthodoxy. Orthodoxy always precedes orthopraxy. And what many of us are arguing is that our orthodoxy, as it relates to political theology, is not orthodox. That's what many of us are arguing. And so it's not a vote harder. It's, hey, let's return to God's word and what is his revealed will. What does he want from civil magistrates? If we look at a Psalm 2, the kings of the earth, the judges, kiss the Son. Well, listen, I'm a dispensationalist. I love literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutics. What did it mean in King David's day when he wrote that psalm for a king to kiss the Son, to acknowledge Yahweh? Well, if we go back to 1000 BC and think about the role of the king in relationship to the religion of a nation, Well, whatever the king's religion was, so too the nation. And so, if you were to ask a reader in 1000 BC, what does Psalm 2 mean? What is God saying when he says to a king and to a judge to kiss the son? What he's saying is, you need to bring Yahwehism into this nation. That's what it would have meant according to a literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutic. That's Psalm 2.
This makes it an impossible situation. My third concern with Christian nationalism: it idealizes the past, it impossibilizes the present. Thirdly, it institutionalizes the church. It institutionalizes the church. The classic Baptist political theory has a separation of church and state, and by separation of church and state, of course, we don't mean it as it's often used today, but more of the classic two-kingdom theology. There's a civil magistrate that rules the civil affairs of the world, the law category in the world, and there is the church that has ecclesiastical oversight that oversees the souls.
Okay, let me pause here for just a moment, because talking about classical Baptist theology, we could go all the way back to one who has been referred to as Mr. Baptist, none other than John Gill. And John Gill writes as regarding kings, he says that kings are to discountenance and suppress impiety and irreligion, and to countenance and encourage religion and virtue. He says kings are the guardians of the laws of God and man. And Christian kings have a peculiar concern with the laws of the two tables, that they are observed and the violators of them punished. Sins against the first table: idolatry, worshiping more than one God, graven images, blaspheming the name of God, perjury, false swearing, profaning the day of worship; and those against the second table: disobedience to parents, murder, adultery. So again, going all the way back to John Gill, first table enforcement was never a concern in some of this historic Baptist theology. And then Jesse mentions two kingdom theology. Listen, Luther was a two kingdoms guy. Calvin was a two kingdoms guy. Two kingdoms still had the civil magistrate punishing blasphemers. It understood that the civil magistrate is tasked with the good of the people, and the good of the church is tied to the good, or rather, the good of the people is tied to the good of the church. And so the civil magistrate was the protector of the church. That is historic two kingdom theology. The idea that you differentiate and split the first and second table and say the civil magistrate only deals with the second table, that's not two kingdom theology, nor is it really historic Baptist theology, not at least according to John Gill.
This form of Christian nationalism erodes that distinction, and by institutionalizing the church, by giving the government oversight and authority in the realm of the church. I think it's helpful to think through how this developed. Augustine's approach to the city of God and the city of man, when Augustine's using that language, he doesn't mean by the city of man government and the city of God church. He meant really like your hopes and how you're partnering with people. It maps onto government really well, but he means more or less that non-Christians are the city of man. But that developed in the Catholic Church to what's called the doctrine of the two swords. In the Catholic Church, you have really two spheres. You have the kingdom of man, ruled by kings and presidents and whatever, and then you have the kingdom of the church, ruled by the church. In the doctrine of the two swords, it's one person who holds both swords, one person who has oversight of both. That's the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. Well, that's been morphed over time to this idea in Catholicism where the actual political leadership is more of a hands-off kind of association. You have the King of England, who's the oversight of the church, really, but not really. He protects it. He's the protector of the church, but he's not really the head of the church, even though that's what the documents might say. That's the classic doctrine of the two swords. The Puritan tradition went a different way. The Puritan legal tradition went separately and said, you have two kingdoms, but let's keep them separate from each other. We don't want one person ruling the church and one person ruling the state. That would be bad. There has to be distinctions. And granted, in early Puritan history, those distinctions were somewhat unfortunate. Like when you think of the kind of church-state separation that some of the Puritans had, like John Owen or Samuel Willard or people like that, I mean, it was often the church IDs the heretics and the government kills them. That was their view of separation of church and state.
So again, historic two kingdom theology is that the civil magistrate does not get involved in the ordinances of the church, but that just as he legislates the second table and punishes violators of the second table, so too violators of the first table. And you can go through just about every historical Protestant confession and you'll find that, whether it's the Savoy, the Scots, the Belgic, the Helvetic, the Westminster, you name it. That's just historic Protestant political theology. That is two kingdom theology. Now, if you want to argue for something else, that's fine, but don't call it two kingdom theology.
They told the government, would you stop calling people heretics? Let us do that. And the government tells the church, okay, would you stop killing them? Let us do that. Great, deal, let's roll. We've moved on from that, of course, but you should have sympathy for some of those guys. Samuel Willard, he's called to testify at the Salem witch trials. There's somebody on trial for, being a witch, and the judge says, what did the pastor say? Call him up, bring the pastor, swear him in. Are there witches? What should we do to him? I mean, how would you respond to that? It's just, again, such a different world that we're in now. But that was the idea of separation of church and state. Christian identity, Christian nationalism often melds those and brings them back together. To use, I think, their own terminology, I would say that the state should be overseeing the law and not the gospel. You don't want to give the state the gospel also. The state or the government messes everything up, don't they? Have you ever encountered something the government's done well? And this is hard for me pastoring in DC, because when I use the word government, it's like the people. They're in front of me at the pews. I'm like, the government's awful. And they're like, hey, I stayed late on Friday. Back off. It was Reagan, right, who said the 9 most frightening words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. There's some truth to that. Would you want to shift gospel implications and church oversight and the power to rebuke slothful ministers and whatnot over to a category of people that don't do their own obligations well? You want them to have more power and power in the realm of the church? Please no. Please no. You want the government to be able to get power to the church to turn the lights on, to have the water come out of the faucet, those kind of things. You don't want them to oversee the ordinances of the church. Fourthly, my first concern is that Christian nationalism idealizes the past. The second, it impossibilizes the present. Thirdly, it institutionalizes the church. Fourthly,
Yeah, so his third point, it institutionalizes the church. I think that's really just a failure to recognize sphere sovereignty. What's really happening here is that Jesse's begging the question by saying that this two kingdom theology, or what we've moved on to, as he said, is that we only enforce the second table. Show me that biblically, right? Make the biblical case. I understand he's making the philosophical case, but okay, again, that's not even historic Protestant theology. So, and again, going back to early American history, blasphemy laws were on the books in most of the states. Matter of fact, if you look up the December 2021 Harvard Law Review, blasphemy and the meaning of the First Amendment, they make it clear that blasphemy was punishable in our country really until the early 1900s. And so that is the historic understanding, that a separation of church and state didn't mean you can't punish blasphemers.
it idolizes ethnicity. It idolizes ethnicity. And forgive me for reading now because I want to stay close to my...
Okay, so it idolizes ethnicity. I paused it there. That was his fourth objection, that this Stephen Wolfe version of Christian nationalism idolizes ethnicity. And remember, he's already given Wolfe's definition that ethnicity isn't necessarily familial skin color. It's really tied to culture, to language, to customs and manners and religion, just as we read in Washington's farewell address or in Federalist Number 2. He says it idolizes ethnicity. So let's keep going here.
Words. Overall, this desire, and presented in books like this, is a desire to guard ethnic heritage. And they use the language of ethnicity, not the language of race. We understand that we are all one race. There's not multiple races. Race is a biological fiction, granted. In their world, they embrace this concept of ethnicity to describe certain shared cultural features. But then they argue that every nation, properly comprised, is made up of only one ethnicity. And as I mentioned...
So that's just historical reality. Every nation really has been made up of one ethnicity. And again, George Washington, the Second Federalist, that's just the case. And the outliers are really obvious. So, for example, you think of the Assyrians. Think about when the Northern Kingdom was exiled. What did the Assyrians do? Well, they recognized that having competing religions, competing people groups, competing customs, that's not how you strengthen a nation. So what did they do? When they exiled the Northern Kingdom, they brought in a bunch of foreigners and deposited them in the land so that everybody would kind of intermingle, and that they would destroy those distinct cultures, because you can't run a nation on multiculturalism. It just doesn't work. It's never worked. Maybe we're finally starting to see right now that it might not be as good of an idea as we thought to bring in people who want to destroy the culture that you presently have.
Earlier, that's just not the route that the United States took. The United States deliberately was designed with multiple ethnicities embraced inside of its borders, from Spanish Catholics to the Dutch, to the slaves, to the Puritans, and everyone in between. The founding of New Mexico predates the founding of Plymouth Rock. Do we count as properly constituted in the United States? And I use the word idolize ethnicity because so much of this argument hinges on putting ethnicity back into the Garden of Eden and seeing it before the fall. A lot of these Christian nationalist arguments hinge on the idea that governments and ethnic divisions would have happened without the fall in the world. Had no sin entered in the world, there still would have been government, because people on one part of the stream need the water for farming, and people on another part of the stream need it for cooling metals or whatever. And so they're going to have to, even though there's no sin, they're going to have to break up into different government divisions to regulate the shared use of resources, and that over time will have cultural implications. And so it's this desire to put ethnic distinctions and government back before the fall.
Okay, let's pause there. This is an important point. I myself, I would see that had Adam and Eve not sinned, as man spread across the globe, you would have ended up with nations. And so by government, when I use the term government, so essentially what I'm referring to is the exercise of divinely delegated authority. That's government. Government existed pre-fall. Adam and Eve were given government over the earth. Adam was given government authority over his wife, and they together were given authority over their children, right? So Adam names Eve pre-fall. He renames her after the fall. Eve then names the children, right? So she is on a separate level than the children. She exercises her authority over the children. And yes, as everybody spread out, there would have been what we sometimes call speciation. So different people groups would have developed different languages. Maybe not. Maybe they would all have the same language. Okay, let's go there. That's fine. But here's the deal. A lot of the argument here is that distinct people groups are a result of the fall. Well, if that's the case, then you have to look at a text like Revelation 21, because in Revelation 21, 24, 26, what we find is that in the eternal state, there are nations and there are kings. And so the question is, well, if civil government and if nations are a result of the fall, then why do they continue into the eternal state? If it's only a product of sin, why do we still have them when there is no sin? What we find is that when there is no sin, we still have delegated authority, civil authority. We still have kings and we still have nations, even in the eternal state. So arguing that they're bad, anything along those lines, that they're merely a outworking of the fall, it just doesn't account for all the biblical data.
And that's why I use the word idolize, because if you have such a care and a hope in something that is important to you, it existed in a sinless world, it might be an idol.
And that, listen, that's kind of a scary argument, because when the Lord Jesus was asked about divorce, how did he answer? Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female? So Jesus argues from the pre-fall creation and its intentions. Paul does the same thing. Paul, when he's arguing about why women can't teach men or exercise authority over men, Paul goes back to pre-fall. He goes back to teleology. He goes back to the garden and what God designed as good. That's exactly where we should be going. And Jesse's arguing that maybe that's a reason to call this view idolatrous, because you have to go to pre-fall to find it. That's a scary, scary place to start going, because Jesus and Paul both argue from pre-fall, what we might even call pre-political institutions. That's how they argue. Therefore, we ought to as well.
It might be an idol. Of course, they would stay away from the concept of race, as I mentioned earlier, and yet so much of their description of ethnicity has racial overtones to it, which leads to all kinds of clumsiness. In a lot of the Christian national circles, there's debates over, are interethnic marriages appropriate? And I've heard some of these Christian leaders say, interethnic marriages or, marriages between people of two different ethnicities are not wise because your kids will be confused. They won't know, where their people are. They won't know what their culture is. You're setting them up to lose if they're part of the fruit of an interethnic marriage. And it's sad, really, the way it's described. And I've even heard one of the leaders say there's a category for a marriage between people of different ethnicities. It's not gay marriage. Gay marriage is no marriage at all. But it's closer to a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. It's unwise and it's foolish and it's not going to be good, but it's still a valid marriage. I'm hearing that going, wow, thanks. If you're married to someone who's not your ethnicity, it's in the category of a foolish marriage to a non-believer. It's just unhelpful and very confusing language. And of course, when they're criticized for that, they always say, but you're not using the word ethnicity the right way. Well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to use it the right way. I've read all the reading, I've done all the books, I've really done my homework. I'm trying to use it like you're using it. And it seems like you're defining ethnicity as shared culture, shared values, shared language, shared traditions, foods, and all of that. I got a concept for that. And people marry from different ethnic groups. And there's this idea that you should freeze all kind of marriages outside of your own nation or language.
Listen, I don't know of anybody advocating for this. Maybe there's a fringe group. Wolf's not advocating for this in his book. that we shouldn't have interethnic marriages. Um, eh, but here's the deal. This is such a fringe position. How does it help answer the question of God's revealed will for the exercise of delegated authority in the civil sphere? That's what Christian nationalism is really all about. So, this again is just kind of the framing of the issue to put in some kind of a distaste. I don't see how this is actually helpful. Listen, I don't have a problem saying that interethnic marriages are good and fine, insofar as those ethnicities, those cultures aren't polar opposites, right? You can't have a Christian marrying a Muslim. Um, and so when we're talking about kind of the outworking of what does it look like to mix two cultures, you can't mix good and evil. But outside of that, what there. But here's the problem. I'm speaking on something that really isn't even my argument. I'm not even that familiar with the argument, and it's kind of a ridiculous argument anyway. It's such a side point. So let me get back on track here.
Which group or whatever, for a period of time until our country sorts itself out and has its own ethnicity that's kind of recovered from the inside out. And it's just really insane, honestly. And it's so different in the way the Bible describes Christians with ethnicity, isn't it? I mean, the Bible doesn't speak of Christian ethnicity like that. The Bible does use the term ethnicity for Christians, of course, but we are a holy priesthood. We are our own kind of nation, so to speak. So to elevate culture, ethnicity to where you're like, oh, it's a close call of two people from different ethnic groups who should get married. It's just such a close call. Shows that you've really lost touch with the overarching force of ethnicity in the Bible. The New Testament does not give the church the mandate of preserving ethnic groups, but of transforming them with the gospel. And that's the Great Commission. So those are my concerns. Christian nationalism presented by Wolf and other Christian nationalists that idealizes the past, impossibilizes the present, institutionalizes the church, and idolizes ethnicity. Now here's my theological concerns.
All right, so there's Jesse's 4 points. The first one, it idolizes the past. I think that's just inflammatory language. Really what's happening here is, as American Christians, we're trying to ask, what is our history? What have those who've gone before us thought? How is our country set up? Is the way it's running now the way it was originally intended? And listen, this is how we always do theology. What did those who had the same word and the same spirit, what conclusions did they come to? So it's not that we're idolizing the past. We're trying to figure out, how did those who went before us think in practice? Number two, it impossibilizes the present. It's just irrelevant. What is God's revealed will? That's what we're trying to answer. Whether it's possible or not my concern. It institutionalizes the church. Again, nobody throughout church history thought that. Going back to John Gill, and seeing the civil magistrate having a first table enforcement, none of the confessions thought that. Even the American founders, when they started our system, they allowed for the states to have blasphemy laws in state churches. So really what Jesse's arguing here for is post-war consensus. It's a novel understanding of nations and the role of the civil government. Number four, it idolizes ethnicity. Again, nations historically were made up of one ethnicity. That's just historical fact. If you've got a new way of doing things, then fine, but let's not pretend that that's either the historical way or the prescribed biblical way. And listen, if we're arguing that this is the prescribed biblical way, let's just be consistent and say that, guess what? We're the first people in 1950 years to get it right. It really wasn't until very recently that we got this right. So there's a lot of issues with this message. I think at this point, this first half is long enough. So I will end it here, and then we'll do a second video with Jesse's biblical critiques.